reactions to drugs, drug responses, are in fact interactions of drug set and setting. Drug means the pharmacological nature of the agent, the dose, and the route of administration. Set is the expectations of the person taking the substance, of the person guiding that trip, and of anyone present. And setting is the physical, social, cultural environment in which a drug is taken. Those non-pharmacological aspects can completely reverse pharmacology. And let me give you a very dramatic example. In the summer of 1960, shortly before I entered Harvard, I was at home in my row house in Philadelphia, and I read an article in the Philadelphia Evening Paper about supposedly the death of a student at a California university from mescaline. The article said he was taking it to get inspiration for a creative writing course. Very unlikely that he died by taking mescaline, but the article made the mistake of quoting from one of his last papers, and all I remember was the line, "Galaxies of exploding colors." I knew at once I wanted to take mescaline. That night at the dinner table, I made the mistake of mentioning it. The reaction from my parents was so horrific that I never said anything about it again. So anyway, I got to Harvard that fall, and I heard that there was a researcher, a young assistant professor named Tim Leary, who was starting off doing research on psychedelics. So I went to meet him, asked him how I could get mescaline. He gave me some suggestions for chemical companies that might sell it. I found one that did. This was in the pre-thalidomide era when FDA regulations on these things were very lax. They didn't ask me any questions. I said I was doing research on mescaline. They didn't say what kind of research. And the next day a package of it arrived outside my dorm room. So now I had this substance. I didn't know how to use it. So I took it on the spring. This is now, I think, April of 1961. So I took a half gram of mescaline, a substantial dose. There were 6 people sitting around waiting to see what would happen to me. It was a very unaesthetic setting. And I felt nothing. So an hour went by, nothing. 2 hours went by, I felt nothing. And then, just after 2 hours, I started to feel physical sensations. Now, the only drug I had experience with at that time was alcohol, which I was using substantially. What I felt, the only way I interpreted it, I felt like the beginnings of alcohol intoxication. At that moment, the phone rang. It was my mother calling from Philadelphia. She never called on a Saturday. We used to talk to each other on Sundays. She said, what are you doing? I said, I'm sitting around with some friends. Why aren't you outside? I said, well, I was just sitting around talking with people. And she said, I hope you're not doing anything foolish like taking mescaline or anything like that. I dropped the phone, talk about a buzzkill, and talk about the psychic powers of mothers. Amazing. She had heard that word 6 months before once, never mentioned again in airplanes. So I had really no experience of taking a half gram of mescaline that time. And it took me quite a while before I learned how to use psychedelics in proper settings with proper set. Psychedelics have been very key to who I am. They have informed my philosophy of integrative medicine, my understanding of health and healing, my understanding of reality, of the interaction of the mind and the body. I could tell you so many stories, but I just want to tell you a few. At that same period, when I arrived at Harvard and experimented with mescaline, I was thumbing through the Harvard course catalog, and one course jumped out at me. The title was Plants and Human Affairs. That was a very curious name. I was very interested in plants from a very young age. This was an introduction to economic botany, the study of plants of economic importance other than ornamentals, so drugs, fibers, medicines, dyes, so forth. To register for it, I had to go to the Harvard Botanical Museum, which was a Victorian brick building that housed several of the university museums, and on the 4th floor was the Botanical Museum. And the place where I had to go to register for this this, I mean, it was astounding. It looked like an attic at a university. The walls were decorated with blowguns, arrows, feathered headdresses. And this was the office of Richard Evans Schultes, who was the director of the museum. And he taught that course. He became my mentor. I wrote an undergraduate thesis under him. He was my advisor. Later, he became a friend and a colleague. I was on his staff at the Botanical Museum for 14 years. We worked together. A great man. I'm very grateful to have had his friendship and influence. And I'm a little disappointed that he is often left out in the story of the modern history of psychedelics because he was so key. In 1938, just out of graduate school, he went to Oklahoma and was one of the first white people to be admitted to Native American church ceremonies of the Kiowa Indians. He wrote about peyote. He wrote about its positive influence on the people who participated in this. It was a very important piece of academic work. Then he went from there to Oaxaca, where he really obtained the first accounts of and specimens of psilocybin mushrooms. And this was really important because through the years, most scholars had doubted that there was any ancient use of mushrooms by Mexican and indigenous peoples. Despite a few early reports, most scholars thought that they had confused peyote buttons, dried peyote buttons, with mushrooms. And Schultes was really the first person to document not only past use but ongoing use of mushrooms, to collect specimens of them. Those specimens eventually made their way to Gordon Wasson and inspired him to go discover the ongoing mushroom ceremonies that were being held in the Sierra Mazateca in Mexico. Wasson was a very frequent visitor to the Harvard Botanical Museum, along with many other people that were drawn there by the library. I remember William Burroughs coming through, Albert Hofmann, a whole range of people in the psychedelic scene. So Schultes was, he was very key. After he finished his work in Oaxaca, he went to the Amazon, where he lived continuously from 1939 to 1953 without coming back. And in that time, although his primary work was with orchids, he discovered a number and wrote about a number of hallucinogenic preparations. Among them, he described the preparation of ayahuasca and the various additives that were added to Venus Stereopsis. He wrote extensively about the psychedelic snuffs that were used by indigenous peoples. And these are made from a number of different plants, one of them from the resin of a large jungle tree in the nutmeg family, Viola. And these plants contain DMT and 5-MeO-DMT. And they're taken as snuff, very powerful psychedelic snuffs. I'm going to come back to that later in this talk because I'm going to try to make the case to you that DMT and 5-MeO-DMT are the most powerful and in many ways the most important of the psychedelic agents. And the ones that really deserve great attention for their therapeutic potential and what they show us about the nature of our brains. So another interesting connection there, the undergraduate thesis that I wrote under Schultes was about nutmeg. And it was about the psychoactivity of nutmeg, which had been rumored. There were stories of people taking large quantities of nutmeg to get high. I don't recommend it. It's mostly done in prisons and places where other drugs are not so easily obtained, although I doubt that's the case anymore. And I remember once choking down a whole can of nutmeg to see what would happen. And I definitely got intoxicated, but I don't recommend it. But it was fascinating to me that a household spice could have such a property. So I went through all the literature I could find on nutmeg. There was an extensive historical literature about its uses in medicine, and its intoxicating properties have been noted over the centuries. And these seem to be due to a compound in it called myristicin. Myristicin is sort of related to the phenethylamines. It has that molecular structure. And in the course of writing about it and going through the literature on it, there was only really one paper, scholarly paper, on myristicin. And that was written by a man named Alexander Shulgin, who was then working for a pharmaceutical company. So I began a correspondence with him about Risticin. We became regular pen pals. And eventually, in 1967, we were both invited to present papers on nutmeg at an NIMH-sponsored conference in San Francisco called the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. That was really a milestone conference. The first time that there was federal attention on all of this. There was a section in this conference on ayahuasca, on cannabis, on nutmeg, on kava. And Dennis McKenna last year did a second version of this conference. I think I'm the only person that was, still surviving who was at both of them. But at that conference, I really became buddies with Sasha Shulgin. He was another good friend over the years, a delightful character. We were fellow Geminis. He has a very active mind, great sense of humor, very elfin. And he supplied me with all sorts of interesting psychedelic agents. He was in the early 1970s, mid-1970s, he sent me MDMA and said, try this. And I did, and I said, send more as much as you can. I had used MDA, the parent compound, a number of times, but after taking MDMA, I never wanted to take MDA again. There was too high a price to pay in terms of day after burnout and fatigue. MDMA is a unique molecule, and I don't really consider it a classic psychedelic. It is its own thing. I think calling it an empathogen or an entactogen may be better. I don't know anything else that reproduces that effect. For the therapeutic potential of it is immense. I've taken it many, many times. I've had many, many wonderful experiences with it. I think one of the things that it has taught me is the power of non-defensiveness. That is that when one is in an open, undefended state, wonderful things can happen. And I think a lot of harm results from confronting the universe, confronting external reality, confronting other people in a defended state. I think that makes injury much more likely. I can give all sorts of examples of that, but I'll just mention a couple. One is I found when I was on MDMA, I used to run up and down canyons outside of Tucson, Arizona a lot. I could run up and down canyons barefoot over rocks, jumping from rock to rock. And I could also walk over paths around my home that were paved with crushed rocks. Normally I couldn't do that. It hurt, and the rocks would leave dents in my foot. And when I was in this MDMA state, not only was there no pain, but more interesting, there were no marks on my foot. Now, I find that very, very interesting. What's happening there? And here's my hypothesis. I think if your mind is out of the way and not interfering with muscles, it allows individual muscles and muscle fibers to respond very precisely to pressure. So if a point of a rock is pressing on your bare foot, if you're not interfering with those muscles, they can press back with exactly the force to counteract what's happening there, and there's no net force at the surface. And that's what it feels like to me. And I'd love to see research on that phenomenon. I think it's fascinating. Just another, I could tell you story after story of this kind. Another one is that I remember casually overhearing somebody, I think at a food co-op that I was volunteering at, mention petting bumblebees. And that sounded really interesting to me, so I wanted to pet a bumblebee. So I found a lot of bumblebees, but they weren't interested in being petted. They're bumbling and going about their business, and they don't want to be touched. So one day I was on MDMA in my favorite canyon, and I think I was probably naked and running around and lying on rocks, and it was a beautiful day, and I was eating a section of orange. And some of the orange juice dripped in my palm, and a bumblebee flew down in my palm and was lapping at the orange juice. Maybe it got a little drunk on the orange juice, I don't know. But it not only let me pet it, it let me play with it extensively. I mean, I had a really intimate experience with that elevator. And it flew off afterwards, quite happy, and I was very happy. That would never have happened if I weren't in that MDMA state. Some other stories that I can tell you, and some of these have been printed and reported. Some of them have been used to make fun of me. One on a profile of 60 Minutes did on me, and they quoted this story and they used it as a, an example of how eccentric and crazy I was. But to me, it was very meaningful. I apologize if you've heard this one, but I had a lifelong allergy to cats. If a cat got near me, my eyes would itch and tear, and if a cat licked me, I'd get hives, or it licked me immediately. So I always avoided cats. One day, it was a spring day, this was about 1971. I was living in rural Virginia. I took LSD with some friends. Beautiful day, fabulous trip. I was just feeling terrific, running around, and in the midst of this, a cat jumped into my lap, and I had a momentary defensive reaction, and then I thought, this is silly, and I relaxed and played with the cat, had no allergic reaction, and never had one since. An instantaneous disappearance of a lifelong allergy to cats. I had this idea that I could start Dr. Weil's allergy clinic, where I'd have people come in maybe for 10 sessions. You'd start them with a full dose of LSD and let them interact, and then over the next 1 week apart, we'd cut the dose down to somewhere in there they weren't getting any, just the placebo, or they'd lose the allergies. Allergies can be unlearned. Around the same time, this I found even more remarkable, I also had never gotten tan in my life. Growing up, I was told I had fair skin, and I couldn't get tan, and my experience was that when we go to the beach, I would get second-degree burns, sheets of skin peeling off. In those days, we didn't know about sunscreen. We used things that probably magnified the effect of the sun. But anyway, that was my experience. So I always avoided being out in the sun. And around the same time with the cat, and another LSD trip, another feeling fabulous, I was in back of my house near the woods in Virginia. I was lying on the grass without clothes. Near noon, the sun was up there, and I thought, I should be careful about this. And then again, I had this feeling, this is silly. I'm just going to relax. I was tan the next day. I've been tan ever since. Amazing. People need to pay attention to this stuff. It's really important, and that's one of the reasons why, I feel somewhat disappointed that all the focus in psychedelic therapy is on mental emotional conditions. I think there is a tremendous potential for these in physical medicine. I have seen just remarkable remissions of autoimmune diseases, chronic pain conditions, and this is all a result, it is seeing how changing things in the mental compartment can change things in the physical realm. And as I say, this is one of the fundamental principles in integrative medicine. And, that's absolutely something that I have learned from psychedelics. I just mentioned a couple of other experiences I've had. Sasha Shulgin. Oh, let me tell you one funny story about Sasha. He was very attached to one molecule that he made called DON, 2,5-dimethoxy-4-methylamphetamine. It was released on the streets of San Francisco in 1968 under the street name STP. It's a derivative of mescaline. And it instantly got really bad press. There were a lot of horrible reactions to it. And Sasha maintained that the main reason was that the dosage forms that were distributed were much too high. And but people really did not like this drug. It had terrible reviews. And Sasha kept saying, it was a really good drug, and it had just been maligned. And he kept leaning on me to take it. So finally I said, okay. So he sent me some, and it was packaged in the right dose. So a friend and I took this one morning, and we drove about an hour from my home to a canyon in the mountains outside of Tucson. We set up camp in this wash. I brought musical instruments, We got a whole bunch of things, including body paint that was supposed to wash off very easily. So we painted ourselves up and got ready to do this, and suddenly out of nowhere, black clouds appeared right over us. It was a clap of thunder and a downpour. We obviously couldn't stay there, and then this drug was coming on, and it was coming on really fast and strong, and it was very hard to stand up, and we couldn't stay there, so we had to pack up. And I thought we'd better wash this paint off. It would not wash off. Indelible. So looking like that and feeling that way, I had to drive an hour back across Tucson. And we got to another place where the skies went out clear, and we set up our little camp. The moment we relaxed, black clouds appeared out of nowhere. Rain came down right on us. We had to move again. That happened the third time. And then we gave up. But this drug lasted about, I think it was about 38 hours before it subsided. And I wrote Sasha, sorry, but no, not again. So, however, some of his creations were terrific. He had this whole 2C series of mescaline derivatives that you may be familiar with. There's 2CB, 2CT2, 2CT7. And let me just tell you a couple of quick experiences that I had with some of these. One is that, I think this was 2CT2, I was, again, in one of my favorite canyons, and it was really, really pleasant. A lot of these drugs had the soft feeling of MDMA with various degrees of visual changes that were very pleasant. So I was lying on a very smooth rock. There was water rushing by me. And I became aware of energy coursing through my body, very palpable. And not only did I feel it, but I could see it. And the way I perceived it was there was streaming, corpuscular, multicolored, flow, and it went through my body and into the rock, and it was in everything. It was in all of the rocks, it was in the cactuses, it was in the water, and it was this incessant streaming, as I said, particulate or corpuscular, multicolored, and it was self-aware. I had this strong sense that it was self-aware, and I absolutely believe that what I was perceiving was consciousness, and that it connected me with everything, even things that, I think of as inanimate. And from that moment, I became a panpsychist. If you are not familiar with the term panpsychism, I recommend this is a philosophy which, until recently, was quite obscure, and it's anathema to materialistic scientists. Panpsychism believes that the fundamental stuff of the universe is consciousness. That consciousness exists before matter, and that consciousness organizes matter into more and more complex forms to know itself better. And this is what I experienced. I experienced it as a result of taking that substance. I have experienced since, and that is my unshakable belief that consciousness is what unites us with everything. That's been a just very powerful experience. Another experience I had on one of Sasha's 2C compounds, this was in Utah, in a canyon, a beautiful red rock canyon, and I had run out of water and I had to hike down for where the car was, and on the way down, this was just remarkable. The walls of the canyon, it was as if movies were being projected on them, of actual scenes of prehistoric indigenous life. It was women in colorful clothes making pottery, and this was not hallucinations. This was something that, impressions that existed in the rocks that I was enabled to see. They moved, they were beautiful, and I remember just staggering back against the canyon walls, overwhelmed by how beautiful and how powerful these visions were. And I'm really, really grateful to have had that experience. So, thank you, Sasha, for providing those. That was great. Now, I want to talk to you about the tryptamines. I first took DMT, I can't remember exactly when, but it was probably in San Francisco, the year that I was doing my internship in 1968-69. That was a wild time to be in San Francisco. You know, riots in the streets, the Haight-Ashbury was turning from the summer of love into the amphetamine scene. Psychedelics were everywhere. I experimented with a lot of them. And I remember somewhere along there smoking DMT for the first time. And I don't remember how many times I did it. Very trippy, you know, this instantaneous transportation to another realm, and that realm was very marked by incredibly colorful visions, some of them cartoonish, some of them, you know, just wild. And then this only lasted for a few minutes, and then you came back very gradually, and the feeling of coming back was very pleasant. I had heard about, but DMT was called the businessman's high at that time because it was so short-lasting, and it was not very easy to come by. 5-methoxy DMT, you know, it's close derivative, was legal at that time, and I was able to order it from a chemical company in any quantity that I wanted. And I began experimenting with smoking it. This was probably in the mid-1970s. I don't know how many of you have had the experience of inhaling vaporized 5-methoxy DMT. It is a very powerful experience. It can be scary because it is ego dissolving. It's been described as like a rocket ship into the void. You know, it is as fast as acting as DMT, but there's no visual stuff. There's nothing. You disappear, everything disappears. And then after what, it's a timeless period, but when you, probably it's just a matter of, 5-7 minutes, that when you reconstitute, that is extremely pleasant, that feeling of coming back and reconstituting. And there's, for me, a great feeling of peace afterwards. So I experimented with 5-MeO-DMT quite a lot. I found it really interesting, useful. I thought it was good training for letting go, for dissolving the ego, for maybe even preparation for dying. I thought that it could be very useful for that. I gave it to a lot of people, and mostly the reactions were uniform, although you have to prepare people because it's so fast, and that ego dissolving can be scary if you're not really prepared for it. But I found this amazing. I never had DMT around at the same time, and I would love to have used the two of them together because in nature, in plants, these always occur together. And that's the way that the Amazonian natives use these in the form of snuffs. But I never had a chance to get enough DMT to combine the two and see what that would be like. I did, however, get hold of harmaline, which is the active compound in Banisteriopsis in ayahuasca. That was also a legal drug at that time. So in the preparations of ayahuasca, the ahe, the harmaline inactivates the enzyme in the stomach, monoamine oxidase, that breaks down the tryptamines. You can't take DMT or 5-MeO-DMT orally because they're broken down by an enzyme in the stomach. But harmaline in Banisteriopsis inactivates that enzyme and makes it an orally active preparation. By the way, that's a very interesting story. When anthropologists and ethnobotanists first found Amazonian natives making this drink that contained DMT, they said that the DMT couldn't contribute to the effect because it's broken down in the stomach. And then it turned out that harmaline in Banisteriopsis inactivates that enzyme. So the question is, how did Amazonian Indians discover that? The standard answer you get from anthropologists and botanists is the trial and error. And if you're sitting in a classroom taking notes and somebody says they did this by trial and error, you write that down, okay. But then when I was in South America and making ayahuasca with various shamans, you look around at this profusion of trees and plants in the jungle, it's very hard to imagine, a shaman saying, well, today's Monday, I think I'll try this plant. And I asked a lot of shamans how they learned this combination, and they all gave the same answer, which is that they learned it in visions, that the spirit of Banisteriopsis showed them the plants that were the DMT sources to add to the drink. So I think that's just fascinating, and that, I incline to that explanation. I think when you're living close to nature and open to your intuitions, it is possible to gain knowledge that otherwise you wouldn't gain. Anyway, a remarkable discovery. So I got hold of Harmaline, and I used to take Harmaline with 5-MeO-DMT. I think occasionally I had it with regular DMT. Some people have called this preparation pharmalaska. It's like using purified chemical agents rather than the plants. I had very interesting experiences with those as well, and that's something that I recommend looking into. It's a longer acting effect with interesting visual changes and, again, interesting sense of energy. I think my experimentations with 5-MeO-DMT made me very conscious of energy in my body, of the ability to channel energy, to sense energy. Just one quick story. One period when I had used 5-MeO-DMT, I think several days in a row, I was riding my bike in the afternoon, and I started to feel the effect of it without having taken it. And that was a little unsettling at first. And then I found that by breathing, doing sort of yogic breathing, I could recreate the effect. And part of that sense was a very strong feeling of energy flowing through my body and through my arms and hands. And about that time, I remember coming home, and I had a big garden back in my house, and I had big tomato plants. And they went out to tend to the plants, and I accidentally broke a very large branch of one of the tomatoes. I felt really bad about it. It was hanging on by a thread, and I held it in place, put my hand around it, and I made myself go into that state in which I felt energy. I channeled energy through my hand into the plant. I came in and put a piece of tape around it, and the next morning it was completely healed. So I love that, and it's something that, I am not hesitant to talk about energy medicine and channeling energy in our training of physicians at the University of Arizona. We work with energy healers. I think this is something that's coming in the future. The whole realm of energy medicine. I think there's research will begin to document these kinds of changes, but for me, this all originated in psychedelic experiences. Now, in my explorations of psychedelics, I have been very interested to think about what is the ultimate psychedelic? What is the psychedelic, the original, the most primitive, and I am absolutely convinced it is these tryptamines. It's DMT and MeO-DMT. I think these are the essential psychedelics. I don't think any of the phenethylamines qualify for this, as interesting as they are. LSD is too cumbersome a molecule with all that ergot nucleus. I don't think it's psilocybin, which is closer because it's much closer to the tryptamines, but still has more molecular baggage. I think that these two compounds, DMT and 5-MeO-DMT, most closely resemble the compounds in our brains. It is almost certain that our brains produce DMT. This is probably what mediates endogenous psychedelic experiences. I've had several of these, where very profound, where I felt all the changes mentally and physically of psychedelics without taking anything. The first time I experienced that was witnessing a total solar eclipse in Oaxaca in 1970. Second time was being in a Lakota sweat lodge for the first time, very intense. Third was doing a fire walk with a group trying to set the record for the longest fire walk done in the U.S. You know, in all of those instances, I got completely stoned as if I were on a psychedelic without having taken anything. And I would not be surprised if in those kinds of experiences there is release of tryptamines from the brain, whether that's from pineal, from, you know, these compounds are so closely related to melatonin and to serotonin. So to me, I think these are the compounds that we should really focus on. I think it will turn out that they have the greatest potential for neurodegeneration and creating neuroplasticity. I think they have tremendous therapeutic potential. I know there are several talks happening here at this conference on them, and I'm very pleased to see that there are research groups, you know, starting with them. But the fact that these are so widely distributed in nature, that they're in our brains, that they connect us with everything, I'm fascinated by them. And I can't end this talk without telling you about my adventures with the Sonoran Desert Toad. You know, I lived for a number of years in the center of the habitat of this animal. I lived on the X9 Ranch east of Tucson. It was at the junction of two creeks bordering on Sonoran National Park. On summer nights, there were hundreds of these animals around my home. They're magnificent animals. They're hideously ugly. They're huge. I mean, they're football size. It's very slimy. When you try to pick them up, you really have to grab them to hold on to them. They are eating machines. They would cluster around the outside of my home because they were attracted by the lights. Bugs were there, so they were just constantly feeding. They would mate in my swimming pool. I had an above-ground swimming pool, and there'd be masses of eggs that I had to fish out constantly. And they would also hop in my house. You know, when I'd open the back door, one or two of them would come in and I'd have to chase them down to the So when a friend of mine told me that you could get high by smoking the venom of this toad, that just seemed incredible to me. So I was given a sample of dried toad venom, and I smoked it. And lo and behold, this was the 5-MeO-DMT experience. And I then contacted my friend Wade Davis, another of Schultes' students, and told him about this. And we wrote a paper that was the first scholarly paper written on, it was then called Bufo alvarius, now it's Bufo ancilius. But I think this was a very significant discovery. This was the first time an animal source of a psychedelic had been discovered. And I am very horrified to learn recently of what's happened to the toads. There's been tremendous exploitation of them and commercialization of them. They disappeared a lot from their habitats and over-harvesting. I won't go into that, but I think the fact that this compound exists in these animals and connects us to so many things in the plant kingdom and to our own brains is very significant. Frankly, I think I prefer the effect of the synthetic 5-MeO-DMT to the toad. They're very similar, but I think, you know, I would much prefer to use the synthetic version. And I recommend that. But I hope we will see, you know, much more research on these compounds and their potential. Let me just close with some thoughts. I personally do not use psychedelics that much anymore. I think I've learned what I have to learn from them. As I said, they've been profoundly influential. But I do feel that there's a potential, a possibility that they can save us from the catastrophe that we clearly are headed toward. And frankly, I don't know what else is out there that can do that. You know, maybe God will appear in the clouds, maybe Jesus will return, maybe the aliens will come, but that seems less likely to me. Psychedelics are here at this moment. Their potential to transform consciousness is, I think, limitless. And by the way, I have to give credit to Alfred and Leary for this. They were not only the first people to insist on the importance of set and setting in determining drug reactions, they were also insistent on the potential of these agents to change society. I remember, in my early conversations with Leary, him saying that he envisioned a graduate seminar at Harvard in which students would take a psychedelic agent once a week, and then they would apply the insights they gained to various social problems. He was absolutely convinced that this was, the transformative agent out there. This was back in, in 1960, 1961. He had no sense of the antagonism that he would stir up, or that there would be a societal reaction to all of this. And, that's too bad. But I think now that we've come back, now that we're in this, whatever this is that's happening, the psychedelic renaissance that is filling halls like this with so many people, we're in a new era now, and I think there is tremendous possibilities of awakening people to things beyond ordinary reality, what I've described to you, sensing energies, realizing that consciousness connects us to everything, not only to other beings, but the animals, the plants, the things that are inanimate. I mean, nobody would be harming toads the way they are if they had that psychedelic experience of connected consciousness. So I don't know how this is going to play out. I think there are many ways that this could go wrong, but I remain very optimistic. I think that it is, we are in a very interesting time, and the eruption of psychedelics into our collective consciousness, to me, is one of the most hopeful things that I see out there. So that's really all I have to say to you. Thank you for listening.